On yesterday's show, we discussed who was the most valuable position player on the Mets in 2022. Today, we're moving to the pitchers. Which pitcher had the biggest impact on the Mets' success this season, helping them get to 101 wins? We'll discuss that on this edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Now, when we were entering the 2022 season, if anyone asked us who would be the most valuable pitcher on the Mets in the upcoming season, there would have been two names that would have come to mind: Max Scherzer or Jacob deGrom. I mean, it's that simple. That was how the team was built, with those two guys, set to lead the rotation. And it didn't play out that way simply because of injury. deGrom goes down in spring training. Scherzer goes down in the middle of the season. You get 34 starts from them combined this year. Now, when they were on the mound, I mean, there was no doubting how good they were. And really, if we're going to go and make an argument for who is the most valuable pitcher on the Mets this season, it's hard to overlook what Max Scherzer did, because he was at least healthy for 23 of those starts and, pitched 145 and a third and really was a great ace for the Mets. And they played well when he was out there. Overall, it's very similar to the conversation we had yesterday with Francisco Lindor, where I didn't decide to put Lindor as the most valuable player on the Mets this season, even though his F-WAR would have suggested that he was. For Max Scherzer, he was clearly the most valuable Mets pitcher this year based on F-WAR, with a 4.4 wins above replacement. Now, you look at his stats, a 2.29 ERA is unbelievable. I mean, the crazy thing about Max Scherzer's season is, based on the ERA, which is obviously the most important thing, right? As a pitcher, you're trying to prevent runs. I mean, I think it was the best season of his career. I'm looking right back through, and now, with the Dodgers last year, he had a 2.16 ERA, but you combine it with his time with the Nationals, it was 2.46, 2.92 in 2019, 2.53 in 2018, 2.51 in 2017. Yeah, I mean, he has never pitched to a sub 2.5 ERA over a full season. Granted, he missed some time due to the injury, but the guy was unbelievable when he was healthy. And so, yes, simply based on dominance, no starter was better this season for the Mets than Max Scherzer. And you go to Jacob deGrom and his 11 starts. He has a 3.08 ERA. Those numbers obviously took a hit at the end of the season, where he had that bad start against the Athletics and also a bad one against the Braves. But he struck out over 14 batters per nine, only walked 1.12. He had an expected FIP, which is fielding independent pitching, of 1.54, which just shows how dominant he was to have that type of an xFIP. And he had a 2.2 F-WAR, which put him sixth on the team, despite the fact that he only pitched 64 and a third. I mean, so he came out of nowhere and was more valuable than all these relievers who could be as dominant theoretically late in games, where they're able to just empty the tank. A Seth Lugo or an Adam Ottavino can go out there and just throw gas and be as dominant as they can be. And yet, in a similar amount of innings, I mean, they were nowhere near as valuable when it comes to F-WAR, even though Adam Ottavino still pitched to a 2.06 ERA. It just shows you that value that a starting pitcher brings. And, if deGrom had been healthy the whole year, I think there's no question he would have been the most valuable pitcher on the Mets. And Scherzer, same thing going there. But as we sort of expand out a bit, one of the biggest, things that a starting pitcher can bring is eating innings. And so we look at the innings count of the Mets starters this year, and there's three guys that carry their rotation in terms of workload: Chris Bassitt, Taijuan Walker, and Carrasco, each of them making 29 starts. Bassitt leading the team with 30. Bassitt had 181 and 2/3 innings pitched, Taijuan Walker 157 and a third, and Carrasco 152. Those three guys carried the rotation in terms of taking the ball every fifth day, giving the team length, and getting them through the season. And all of them end up with a similar F4 between 2.4 and 2.7. They were all middle of the rotation guys, but I still look at the Mets season and the fact that they won 101 games, and it doesn't happen without those three guys. Now, granted, Taijuan Walker had a mixed year where he was better in the first half, a little bit worse in the second half. Very similar to what we saw in 2021, but not as drastic. Overall, he pitched to a 3.49 ERA. You look at the expected ERA of 3.94, expected FIP of 3.89. Shows you he maybe was a little bit fortunate pitching in front of a great defense that maybe lowered that ERA a hair for him. But, he did a great job keeping the ball in the yard this year. Home run per nine of 0.86. When it comes to the Mets starters, that was second best on the team behind only Max Scherzer. So that's a really impressive mark from him, and especially for a guy that gave up a ton of home runs in the second half last year. I mean, Taijuan was really solid, and the thing is, I think he's probably the least likely to return to the rotation because I believe Carrasco falls right into place based on that option the Mets have on him. Bassitt, they also have a mutual option, which I'm sure they're likely to accept. Bassitt will probably decline. They'll extend him a qualifying offer, and we'll see if Bassitt returns, but there's still that chance that he comes back on a one-year deal or even a multi-year deal. Taijuan, I think, is in this point where he's going to price himself out of the Mets because they're ultimately going to look at Tyler McGill and Joey Lucchesi and think that next year they can maybe get similar production from those guys at a fraction of the cost. But Taijuan was really good for the Mets, just not quite the most valuable pitcher. And I'd say the same thing about Carrasco, but I want to dive into that more in just a minute here because Carlos Carrasco and Chris Bassitt had the best winning percentage. When the Mets started, those two guys produced better winning percentages than any other starters on the Mets. So I want to dive into those numbers in just a minute here and make a case for why either of those guys could have been the most valuable pitcher the Mets had this season. Before we get to that, though, today's episode of Locked On Mets is sponsored by SimpliSafe Home Security. The numbers don't lie. In the last decade, over 4 million people have chosen SimpliSafe Home Security to protect their home, including this guy right here. Having SimpliSafe in my new apartment has just given me so much peace of mind to know that I'm okay. I have 24/7 monitoring agents that have my back in case of any threat. They'll detect it. They'll dispatch the police. And in case of any emergency, even if I'm not home, they'll have first responders, police, whatever is needed. SimpliSafe blankets my home and will blanket your home as well with protection with advanced sensors for every room, window, and door, HD security cameras for inside and outside your home, and smarter ways to detect motion that only alerts you when a threat is real, and even hazard sensors that instantly detect fires, floods, and other threats to your home. Their monitoring experts use a proprietary advanced response technology to visually confirm when a break-in is real so you can get the highest priority police dispatch. Customize the perfect system for your home in just a few minutes at simplisafe.com/lockedonmlb. Save 20% on your SimpliSafe security system when you sign up for an interactive monitoring plan and get your first month for free. Visit simplisafe.com/lockedonmlb to learn more. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. Now, to say Carlos Carrasco or Chris Bassitt was the most valuable pitcher on the Mets this year is a little bit far-fetched just based on the stats and how dominant Max Scherzer was. But I do think that a case should be made for them in the sense that when you have starters, you just want these guys to go out and give you a chance to win. And I look at where the Mets ended up finishing this year with 101 wins. And I broke down the team record for each of their starters when they took the ball. So this isn't just their personal record. This is when Chris Bassitt started a game for the Mets. How many games did they win? How many games did they lose? In 30 starts, the Mets went 20-10 when Chris Bassitt was on the hill. That's a .667 winning percentage, the best on the team. Go down the line. Carlos Carrasco, 19-10. .655 winning percentage. So just one win difference between Bassitt and Carrasco. David Peterson, in 19 games that he started, 12-7. The Mets were .631 winning percentage. Scherzer at 14-9, 608 winning percentage. Taijuan Walker 16-13, a 551 winning percentage. And Jacob deGrom, last among starters, 6-5, 545 winning percentage. I have no idea why the Mets can't win when deGrom is on the hill. It's not based on the way he pitches, but a crazy trend that I guess has followed him into another season. But getting back to Bassitt and Carrasco, I mean, these guys were sensational this year. And if you look at all of the Mets pitchers, Chris Bassitt, the only one who's considered qualified for an ERA title or something of that nature. Now, he pitched to a 3.42 ERA, 3.46 expected ERA, 3.72 expected FIP, 8.27 strikeouts per nine, 2.43 walks per nine, kept the home runs per nine under 1 at 0.94. Chris Bassitt is a really quality starting pitcher, and overall, what I loved about him is just the fact that he gave you length so frequently and just was that constant. You know, I think he was the most valuable pitcher the Mets had when it comes to the rotation, in the sense that he was always taking the ball. He had a couple of down stretches, particularly playing against some West Coast teams, but you look at the numbers all together at the end of the season, what he was able to accomplish, the way he pitched down the stretch in the second half, which was very strong. Let me look at these splits again. I remember leading into the playoffs, we were talking about it. In the second half, he pitched to a, where is the 2.94 ERA across 13 starts in September, 2.93 ERA. August, his best month, a 1.62 ERA across 5 starts. But that's the thing. Bassitt gave you innings. He was always there. He was that one constant in the rotation, along with Carlos Carrasco, and to a certain extent, Taijuan Walker. But I think that Bassitt just proved to be a little bit better than those two guys. And in that respect, I'd say he's the most valuable pitcher the Mets had that was on the rotation start to finish. Scherzer, based on the dominance, likely gets the nod by most. But there's still one other guy to discuss. A guy that's up for a contract, who had a historic season. And really, the more I thought about it today, trying to decide who I would deem the most valuable pitcher on the Mets, as crazy as it is to say it, it's the closer to me. Edwin Diaz, I believe, was the most valuable pitcher the Mets had this season. We'll discuss that more in just a minute, but first, a quick word from our sponsors. Edwin Diaz just put together one of the greatest seasons a reliever has in MLB history. 1.31 ERA, just absolutely dominant. Expected ERA of 1.69. His fielding independent pitching is 0.90. His expected fielding independent pitching, 1.04. He struck out 17.13 batters per 9, which is absolutely absurd. A strikeout percentage of 50.2, struck out throughout an entire season. Over half the guys he faced. Only walked guys at a 7.7% clip, which makes his strikeout to walk percentage ratio, the difference there, at 42.6%, the best among any reliever in the game, and 10% better than the best. His every single advanced metric you look at, he's basically leading relievers. The guy was by far the best relief pitcher in baseball this season, and I just talked about record for starters, and obviously Diaz is mostly coming to games with a lead, so it's not necessarily fair to look at his appearances this season and say, hey, look at the winning percentage the Mets had when this guy took the mound, but I'm still going to do it anyway because it's absurd. When he pitched, the Mets won 51 of his 61 games, so there's only 10 times where he pitched in a game that the Mets lost. Now, granted, that's largely based on role, but, if you go out there and you're blowing games, your winning percentage as a team when Edwin Diaz is out there wouldn't have been as great. Let's go back now, actually. This will be fun. I'm going to pull up what the Mets' winning percentage was in games that Edwin Diaz pitched in 2019. That year, they were 42-24 when Diaz was on the mound. That's still having a closer role for most of the season. So that would be a 636 winning percentage instead of a winning percentage over 800. Again, that's not an exact science or any stat that I would look at typically, but my point more is when Diaz came in, he was notching saves, he was holding leads, he saved 32 games this year, and he was so ridiculously dominant. Left on base percentage of 90.4, third best among all relievers. You look at the ground ball percentage that he got, and obviously there's other guys that do more, but when you're still striking out guys at the rate that he did to get a ground ball percentage of 46.9, to have a home run per nine of 0.44, which was very high out there among relievers. Not the top mark. He was still in the top 30, though. He was tied with a couple guys, actually top 25, tied with three different pitchers with 0.44 home run per nine against. But the guy was just ridiculously dominant, and when you think back to the season that was and where the Mets ended up and kind of the narrative of the year, it's hard to find anybody that was more valuable than Edwin Diaz. I think back to the game where the Mets had the combined no-hitter, and I was actually in attendance for that. And, being at the ballpark for that game, as we're watching it, you're looking at Tyler McGill, and he kind of labored his way through and walked some guys, and you're just like, oh, wow, a pitch count's high, but he just made it through 5 or whatever it was with a no-no. And then you go to each guy in that bullpen, and every guy that comes out, you think, is this going to be the one that's going to give it up? Is this going to be the one that gives it up? And then you finally get to Edwin Diaz, the end of that game, and the confidence was off the charts. And you're in that ballpark, you knew it was going to happen because Diaz was out there, and you just saw after a couple of pitches he was on, and that's what we saw throughout the season. When Edwin Diaz goes out there and he dots his slider at 94, 95 miles per hour, down and away at that corner of the zone, or if he fires away a fastball at 101 at the top of the zone that guys just swing through, you know that no matter what happens, he is going to be able to overpower hitters and strike them out. And even if he gives up a hit here or there, he has the stuff to work himself through any jam. So Edwin Diaz, to me, to have that type of value as a closer, he was the most valuable pitcher on the Mets in 2022. Now, granted, Scherzer, was right up there based on the wins above replacement stats and some of those other metrics that you could look at, and his dominance over more innings than Diaz pitched. I mean, he was really great, and he pitched, over double the amount of innings, but still, based on role, I think Diaz more valuable. Chris Bassitt and Carlos Carrasco, they took the ball a bunch. They gave the Mets a chance to win. They ate a lot of innings. Really important. Not quite the value as what Edwin Diaz was bringing, locking down all of those wins for those guys. Those guys would not have won as many games if it wasn't for Edwin Diaz in the back end closing type ball games for the Mets. So he is the pitcher that the Mets, I think, are prioritizing more than any this offseason, which is crazy considering the fact that 4 of the guys out of your rotation could potentially be on new teams. But it makes sense to me to make sure Diaz is locked up. And then the question just goes back to what we've been discussing all offseason when it relates to Bassitt, deGrom, Carrasco, Walker to a certain extent as well. Are any of them going to be back? How much money are they going to get paid? And how else can they augment this rotation around what is currently just Max Scherzer and David Peterson as the only sort of guarantees with McGill and Lucchesi as being depth guys currently. So we'll see how everything shakes out. But again, when it comes to today's show, who was the most valuable pitcher on the Mets in 2022? My answer, Edwin Diaz. Now, on tomorrow's show, Throwback Thursday, what I want to do is a little bit of history, but also a player review. So we are going to look back into Mets history and try to decide if anyone had previously had a better season at shortstop than the one that Francisco Lindor just produced. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game repacks, and the take of the day. Follow Locked On Sports Today wherever you get podcasts.